We fixed that. All right. This event is part of our commemoration of, as you all know, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And we're so pleased you're with us. I'm Karen Crowley, president of our Washington State League. We welcome our guests as well, who I believe are now watching us live on YouTube. Thank you all for joining us. Now, I know most of you know our guest, but I want to give you a short bio. And Heather, as a bow to historians, I want to cite my source. It's Wikipedia. Heather Cox Richardson is an American historian who works as a professor of history at Boston College, where she teaches courses on the American Civil War, the Reconstruction era, the American West, and the Plains Indians. She previously taught history at MIT and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Richardson has authored 7 books on the history of politics, and in 2019, many of you know she started publishing Letters from an American, a nightly newsletter that chronicles current events in the larger context of American history. And here's an interesting fact. According to Substack, as of July, the newsletter had over 2.9 million subscribers, one of the most popular Substack publications. Richardson focuses on the health of American democracy and advocates for studying history to learn how to distill complex situations into something easier to understand. And I admit to reading her letters daily because it gives me a much needed and valued perspective on the extraordinary events that we see unfolding today. So, Heather, the League of Women Voters of Washington has over 3,100 members in 20 leagues across the state. Our newest league just formed in Grays Harbor County, Washington, and we have interest in a new league in Lewis County, Washington. So we're growing. And like you, we are deeply concerned about the health of our democracy. Our mission, empowering voters and defending democracy. It's in the context of this shared mission and with great delight that I welcome you to the conversation. I want to introduce you to our moderator for this discussion about your book, How the South Won the Civil War, our Snohomish County League member, Kathy Gill. Kathy has compiled a list of questions from members, and she'll be taking you through the list over the next hour. Let's get started. Kathy, over to you.
Thank you. Let me add my thanks for your joining us today, Heather. Now, we'll begin with questions directly related to the premise of the book, and then we'll move to questions dealing with the future of democracy and request about how to best take action. We will conclude the questions with 1 or 2 from League members in today's Zoom audience, assuming we have time, as well as our drawing for the signed first edition of How the South Won the Civil War that you so graciously donated. To my Zoom audience, just use the Q&A feature, tap the 3 dots in the menu bar to see your options, and submit your questions there for consideration by about 12:30. Let's get started. Now, Heather, we understand that the mid-1800s are your research specialty. Would you please take a moment and share with us the inspiration or the trigger for this book? Its publication date was very close to your starting Letters from an American in 2019.
Yeah, it's a great question. Nobody's asked me that before, but first, let me thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I don't have to tell you the history of the League of Women Voters, but it is an old and historic organization that has been central to expanding the right to vote in the United States, and it's one very close to my heart because, as I was saying before we went live, it actually is not exactly featured in what is a new sweeping book, but it's a really important player in a new sweeping book. So I'm spending a lot of time with your foremothers and a few forefathers, and it's kind of exciting to be here and seeing it being carried on forward. And I love that there's yet another chapter forming because we should have chapters everywhere. All right, that's nothing you all didn't know. So the story behind this book is a funny one because one of the things about the way I work is I don't like to be without a big project. I like to have a book underway. And when I finished the book before this, I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. And I had 3 ideas. And I shared them with a friend, another historian, a well-known historian. And I said, I'd really love to do a joint biography of William Tecumseh Sherman and John Sherman, because William Tecumseh Sherman was the military leader of the American government really after the Civil War. And most people don't know he's actually moved from the South out to the West to engage in the wars against Indigenous Americans. And he's instrumental out there. But his brother, to whom he was very, very close, was the senator who put together the economic packages that constructed the late 19th century. And their back and forth is fascinating. If anybody is interested in it, you can find those letters in a book by Rachel Sherman Thorndike on Google Books. It's free. It's out of copyright. And I was like, I think that'd be a really cool book. And he's like, yeah, no one cares. And then I said, okay, well, I will. Then the other one is I'd love to write a biography of Tom Scott, who was really the big railroad baron of the late 19th century and instrumental in where our railroads lines went down and important in the election of 1876 and what we know as the Compromise of 1876, which is problematic. But he's all over all these important strikes and everything. And he goes, yeah, no one cares about that either. And I said, well, well, I'm thinking about a book. It's a funny thing, but it really strikes me that nobody has taken a look at the degree to which the American West was a political entity that worked with the American South, and that there's a lot there in terms of the culture and the politics. And he went, that's a prize-winning book. And I was like, really? So then about a month later, I was talking to my agent and did the exact same thing. I said, I want to write about the Shermans. And she said, joint biography, no one will read it. It's like, well, I want to write about Tom Scott. She's like, Andrew Carnegie, nobody wants to read it. And I said, well, while I'm waiting, there's this idea about this article I could write. And she said, that's a prize-winning book. So I spent the next several years, I don't know how many, trying to figure out how to shape this book. And I couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it. And I wrote to my agent, and I kept saying, come on, let's do something else. This isn't so good. And she kept saying, keep noodling at it. And I came in from grocery shopping one January. And there was tons of snow, and I had 2 giant LL bean bags full of groceries. And I walked in my door, and there's a big counter in my kitchen. And I put down the groceries, and I took off my backpack. I carry my laptop everywhere, and I didn't even take off my coat. I put the laptop on the counter, and I just started typing. And 5 hours later, all the groceries were ruined, but I had a book proposal, and I just hit send. I didn't even reread it. And I sent it to her, and she wrote the next day, and she said, you've done it. I'm going to put this on the market. And I said, are you just saying that because if I'm sick of it and that I won't ever write this book otherwise? And she said, no, I'm saying that because you have finally nailed it. And what this was an attempt to do was to integrate the American West as a political entity. We all talk about it as a colonial era or a cultural era or an economic area or an environmental area, but as a political entity into the rest of the United States. And from that idea came everything else, the ideology, the fact that they had their own Congress for years, which I don't think anybody knew but me. I mean, I think I found that. That was the attempt to make a larger picture of the United States of America with the West as a separate political entity. And, I think it works, but that's where it all came from.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to go out of order on the questions that I gave you in advance, because this leads into a question from one of our members. Washington granted women's suffrage in 1910, and it was the 5th state to do so, and they were all Western states. So how does that complicate your argument that the Southern hierarchy took root in the West? Or how does your theory still fit with that move towards giving the franchise to women?
I'm actually going to be a real jerk here and correct that language of giving the suffrage. What I always like to emphasize is when the government recognizes the right of suffrage, because that shifts the whole balance of it. And I know that's just me being, particular about that. But that's a great question, because there's a couple of things going to work there. And one is you have to remember that in the early years of women's suffrage, exclusively in Wyoming and Utah, they're coming out of the Civil War. And as they are coming out of the Civil War, there is initially this movement to make sure that anybody, by the way, this is totally fun. Nobody ever asks me this stuff anymore. And this is actually obviously where my heart is. there is this idea that, in fact, on the heels of the Civil War, there is going to be a revolution in opening up the suffrage to all sorts of people who previously were not included in the suffrage. And so it's much easier to make those things happen in the American West than it is in the American East, where you've already got a whole bunch of laws that are preventing suffrage, and that itself is its own story. But if you if you think about coming out of the Civil War, many women who had, after all, raised money for the Union, they had worked for the Union in factories, they had sent their sons and husbands off to war, some of them had fought themselves, many had spied, they believed that they were going to have a say in the post-war government. And they expect that they are going to have a say in the post-war government. And when they get shut out of the 14th Amendment in 1868, it's actually written in 66, but it's ratified in 68. That's the point when they begin to organize women's suffrage associations. So you get the American Women's Suffrage Association, and then you get the American Women's Suffrage Association in 69. Right? They're often, you see them in textbooks talked about in 1890. That's when they come together. But they're actually formed in 69, and that actually really matters. And I could talk about those two organizations. But out in the West, especially in Wyoming, and if you have access to a law library, there's a whole series of laws collected initially by Pauli Murray, of all people, that you can read through the territorial and the state laws for every state, especially the Western states. But Wyoming wants women to have the suffrage, in part because they're trying to convince women to move to Wyoming because nobody lives there and they need women. I always think of that scene from Bloom County where the alien comes down behind the kid who's looking at the stars and unfurls a sign that says Mars needs women. I always think of that in terms of Wyoming because they could have done the same thing. Wyoming needs women. So Wyoming territory recognizes the right of women to vote in 1869. And it's, of course, everyone's heralding of it. And then in 1870, Utah does the same thing. And Utah does the same thing because the non-Mormons in the Utah territorial legislature believe that women will vote against polygamy, that they will vote against this practice that they are trying to get rid of. So they expand the suffrage to women. And in 1870, and then women in Wyoming actually support polygamy because they actually vote very much like their husbands do. And at that point, both Utah and I think Wyoming try to take the suffrage away from women because they're like, wait a minute, this is not going the direction that we thought it was going to go. So you get this hiatus where you don't get women's suffrage for a while. And then, as you say, at the end of the late 19th century and early 20th century, you start to see women getting the right to vote in a number of places in the American West, initially over things like school committee and, local elections, because they put so much effort into bringing the schools into so many of the Western territories and states. And so you start to see it developing, but that's the backstory to what I think is a very different thing by 1910. And that is, although what I focused on in How the South Won was the Confederate idea and that individualistic ideology coming out of, for example, the image of the Alamo, and the fact that when people talked about the history of the American West in that period, they focused on Davy Crockett and they focused on Kit Carson, and they had this really mythological vision of American individualism. What you also have going on in the American West, and actually always did have going on in the American West, is the fact that it was really not possible to survive as a community in the West without having a lot of friends and without having communities. And that's a really interesting rabbit hole if you want me to go into it. But what that meant is that it's the West that sees populism. It's the West that sees the beginning of these much more community-oriented organizations, like the settlement houses back east. You've got these community organizations in the American West. And I would argue that the recognition of the right of women to vote in Washington in 1910 is the forerunner of something incredibly important, which is actually what the new book is about. And that is the reworking of the American government to recognize the importance of all the individuals in a community, as opposed to simply the individualistic guys who are a paycheck. And so I think that in a way, by the turn of the 20th century, you're seeing the death of what I wrote about in How the South Won the Civil War, with the rise of this sort of settlement house populism, political alliance movement idea across across the country, that is going to become the modern American state in the middle of the 20th century. So I don't think it sort of refutes or supports what I wrote about in How the South Won. I think it perhaps marks a different political era in which there is going to be a different ideology behind American politics.
Thank you. Now let's go back in time a little bit. In the book, you highlight the history, rationale, and impact of the 3/5 clause. One of our members wants to know, what are some other constitutional provisions that protected slavery that you either did not discuss or only lightly touched upon? And what are their effects today?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question that I'm going to take in a little bit different direction. And that is one of the things you hear about all the time, is how the Electoral College, theoretically, according to what a lot of people say, was put in place to protect human enslavement. It's really not what shows in the debates over the Constitution, because remember, when they're writing that Constitution at the end of the 1780s, they don't expect that enslavement as a key element in the production of cotton is going to continue. Because at the time, what they are operating on is short staple cotton, and it's very sticky, and it's hard to get those seeds out of the cotton. And so cotton is profitable, but it's not over the moon profitable. And they are, sort of have blinders on and think, well, maybe it's not going to last. And they haven't just, my big thing is that if enslavement had existed when the Americans moved into the mines of the West, we would still have it, or we would have had it well into the 20th century because of the affinity of mining for enslaved labor. But that hadn't happened yet either. So they're really not thinking about protecting slavery per se. Of course, they're going to protect the importation of human beings as enslaved people until the early 1800s. But when they're looking at things like the Electoral College, they're not thinking about having to protect this institution long term, because you're not going to get Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which is the kicker, until the early 1890s. 1790s. I'm sorry, wrong century, and that's an important difference. 1790s. So they finished the Constitution, and within a decade, all of a sudden, the profitability of cotton is off the freaking charts. Everything has changed, and that timing matters a lot. Had it been reversed, who knows where we would have been. But the Electoral College becomes a major supporter of the existence of human enslavement, but that's not the way it was intended. It was actually intended for something really interesting. And that is that if you read the debates that we have, and mind you, those debates are not original to the time. Madison put them together afterwards, so they are, there are ways in which we know that he altered things in order to support his present day concerns. But what they're really worried about, and why they come up with the Electoral College, is they're really, really worried about somebody figuring out a way to manipulate the vote to remain in power as a dictator. And so they kick up a whole bunch of different ways to try and elect a president. Well, maybe the Congress should do it. And they say, no, not that. Then it's just going to be a question of time till we have a dictator. And they say, well, maybe we should do it by popular vote. And they say, no, not that, because they're really very concerned about the existence of a group called the Society of the Cincinnati, who are the officers that served under George Washington and are fiercely loyal to him. And of course, they're spread out all over the colonies or all over the states. And they're really worried that somebody might be able to tap into the Society of the Cincinnati the way, for example, that the Republican Party tapped into the Grand Army of the Republic after the Civil War. So they say, we can't have a popular vote either. What are we going to do? And this comes up again and again and again. If you look at those journals, you will, in the index for the Electoral College, you'll see it's really long because they talk about it a lot. And what they come up with is they want to come up with a system that is not associated with any of the existing government. So if you look at the requirements for the Electoral College, you can't be holding office when you're a delegate or an elector. It doesn't meet in any of the places that the government meets and so on. And they try and create this system that is not associated in any way with the government to prevent the rise of a dictator. They are not thinking about human enslavement. However, you get the Eli Whitney's cotton gin, you get the incredible rise of the economic power of the American South at the same time that the rise of cotton and its increasing use of large tracts of land means that the American South does not develop the kinds of population growth that the North does. And that's when you start to see Southern enslavers doubling down on the idea of the Electoral College to protect their institutions. So that actually comes later. But some of the other ways in which enslavement shows up in the Constitution is not, of course, only in the extension and then the stopping of the slave trade, which is deeply problematic. It doesn't really stop. That's what the Constitution says, but the story of it not stopping is sort of interesting. But the other place that people don't know it shows up that I think is really interesting is in the 14th Amendment. So if you think about the 14th Amendment, they talk about Indians not taxed. And there's a number of reasons they do that. First of all, if you are an Indigenous American who has not assimilated into American society, of course, many of them had, and they are Indians taxed, right? But if you are an Indian who is not taxed under the 14th Amendment, you will be living on, at that point, the time they're writing the 14th in 66, you're going to be on your own territory, not in an organized, of course, the territories are organized then. They were organized during the war, but basically the Congress has just said these are our territories. They haven't actually done much out there yet. They do that in part because if you are part of the American body politic, it's legal to sell you guns. And they don't want the Indigenous Americans on the plains to have access to the really good guns that are circulating back east. They have guns, but they don't want them to be able to get the really good guns. That's not as effective as the people who wrote it would hope. But the other piece of it that we never talk about is the reason they don't want to count Indians not taxed is because they're really worried that what's going to happen in the American West is what happened in the American South. That is, if you count Indians not taxed in what is going to become, or what is Montana at that point, for example, or South Dakota or North Dakota, that's all one Dakota territory at that point, there's going to be a whole lot of people there who don't vote, don't have the right to vote, and will be represented by one guy or more than one guy, depending on how many people they are. And they're afraid they're going to create the same kind of rotten boroughs that they created, that the Constitution created by that 3/5 clause. That, that was Black Americans who couldn't vote, but who were counted toward representation. And that gave the South more power than it would have had they not been counted. And that's what they're afraid of with the 14th Amendment. So how do those things play out today? That's probably more than we have time to get into because it's a bit detailed, the idea of rotten boroughs and the idea of Indigenous Americans and whether or not they can vote. But I think you see the echoes of that still today in that idea that Indigenous Americans not taxed, and that gets caught up in the laws around reservations, for example. That still, I think, echoes today in our fights about whether or not Indigenous Americans should have access to the vote, which is very much on the table, even though legally, of course, they can vote. Many of them have such a hard time getting to a polling place, they are effectively disfranchised.
Okie dokie. Sticking with the amendments for a moment, assuming that there is a blue wave this fall, how might Congress write laws to strengthen the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? And as a corollary, realistically, what do we need to do to reinstate our commitment to equal justice and the rule of law?
The first thing I would do, if it is not already done by statute, with a new constitution is get rid of Citizens United. And the second thing I would do is end partisan gerrymandering. And along with that, the measures to protect the vote, for example. And the reason that I would start there is because if you think about making sure the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are enforced in the United States of America, the organization that is supposed to do that is the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice was literally created by Congress in 1870 to make sure the 14th Amendment was honored by the states. We don't actually have to change that amendment to make it honored. We need the Department of Justice to do its freaking job. And if you start unwinding where we are right now, we need senators to say we are not going to confirm people like Todd Blanche or Pam Bondi. We're going to confirm people who are really going to enforce our laws. And in order for that to happen, this sounds stupid. I actually spent a lot of time thinking about stuff like this. We need to get rid of partisan gerrymandering in such a way that it doesn't privilege the far right candidates that increasingly have dragged the Republican Party off cliff. So in a funny way, rather than talking on that scale about amending the Constitution, although I do think we should be amending the Constitution in different ways, the real concern I have with making the 13th, 14th, and 15th exist is, in reality, is making sure the Department of Justice will do its job. And in order to do that, we have to unrig the Senate. And then that means we have to unrig the vote. That being said, let me tell you, and you must know it if you read me, I have a very, very large problem with the phrase or the clause in the 13th Amendment that outlaws enslavement except as punishment for crime for which somebody is duly committed or duly convicted. And I think America has a real problem with the with prison labor and with what is permitted in the United States. And I just think it flies under the radar screen for almost anybody. If you have not had a friend in federal prison, as I have, you don't really see the degree to which we have this very large incarcerated population. And that is a drag not only on the people who are incarcerated, especially under a private prison system, but also on their families because one of the things about them is in order for people to have access even to enough food in the prison that my friend was in, people from outside had to put money in his commissary account, and that money then went to the commissary for extra food, and they charged at the time $2.50 for a single pack of ramen. Well, I could afford that, but the people who were in prison with him were taking money out of their communities that should be doing something else in order to feed people in the prison system. And that's probably more than you cared about to hear, but I just think we need to deal with our prison population and how it interfaces with our economic system in a much bigger way than we've been doing. And of course, now we've also got the issue of detention for undocumented immigrants, which is just compounding the problem. So I'd fix that.
And another way to fix it is to actually make it so everyone knows that it exists, because I think it's a hidden problem. It doesn't get media attention anyway.
Let's hope we just did that to some.
No. I mean, I know you do, but I meant the mainstream media. So here's a little longer one. In today's political discourse, especially in the space of digital media, there seems to be a war between reliance on facts and observation of outcomes versus the narratives that just appeal to emotion. How can we make people feel really good about factual accuracy? Because right now, these two points of view seem to be mutually exclusive in the digital space.
Couple of things there. That's a really good point, that when you often hear what has become a derogatory term, the liberal media, and that is a complicated term that I'd be happy to talk about. It was designed to be an epithet by the radical right. I like to think of it as the fact-based media versus the image-based media. And if you think about it that way, that sort of helps get rid of this both sidesism, because there are plenty of people who embrace what would be called conservative positions that are fact-based. And we need that. We need to have these broad-based discussions based in fact. That's how you move the ball forward. But that your observation is a really good one, that especially now, and you could see it today, we're recording on July 29th, there have been in the last week 3 hearings in Congress in front of Republican dominated committees that are very clearly designed simply to rile up the MAGA base, especially the MAGA base on X. And I'm not going to actually put those people's names out there again, because I sort of feel like you got to try and protect them, but even though everybody else is talking about them. But you can really see that there's no attempt here to get at any kind of fact, that there is a deliberate attempt to assassinate the characters of 2 public servants in order to rile up a base, and that it works, right? But here's a kicker. There are a lot of studies about how emotions drive people's political behavior, and you always hear the most important ones are fear and anger, and that is certainly the series of emotions that the radical right is wheeling out now. But there is another emotion that is equally powerful. Another 2 emotions. They are hope and inspiration. And that sounds really hokey, but when you think about it, the dog, if you're on social media, the dog that those people rescued from that river? Like, I didn't even remember where it is. I didn't remember what country it's in. But all of you know that dog, that they made the human chain and they got the dog out, and now there's a statue to them getting the dog out of the river. That inspiration, the idea of doing something good as a group of people for others, or even doing them as a single person for others, is as or more powerful than fear and anger and hate. And that, I think, is one of the things that we need to lean into as people trying to protect democracy. And that's actually what we were up to when my team did the 250 to 250 project, 100 short videos, no, 250 short videos. I'm sorry, I don't do math, about American history, is to recognize the bad things that Americans have done. Because one of the brilliant things about America, the United States of America, is that we reflect humans, and people are going to people, as I always say. So we've done a lot of really bad stuff, but we've also done a lot of really good stuff. And we're always at our best when we lean into the good stuff. So what we were trying to do was to recognize the horrible circumstances in which Americans have found themselves in the past, and also recognize the ways in which they have overcome those things. They have worked to build a better country, the way they have used the things that that really reflect poorly on the United States in order to build something better. And I actually think we are ready for that. And I say that by virtue of the fact that I read the books that come out. And it's very clear right now, if you look at the new books coming out in politics, especially. Immediately after Trump was elected the second time, there were a bunch of sort of horrified deer in the headlights books, like, what are we going to do now? And then there were a bunch of books and articles talking about, here's how we resist. Now there's a bunch of books about, how do we do better? How do we build back better? And I actually think that's a pretty natural progression, and we're moving into it now. And there's a lot of room there for people, to be inspired. I was in New Hampshire recently, I don't know when it was, and there's a fabric artist there who has made just a spectacular quilt through the resist dye techniques. And it says resist, and it's going on the road as part of a tour. And it's like, you might have thought as a fabric artist in rural New Hampshire that there was not a way you could move the needle. but she brought her artistic sensibilities and talents to the idea of creating something beautiful to move us forward. And I think we're kind of at that place right now, and we should lean into it.
Thank you. In the book, you trace how divinely inspired class hierarchies shaped the 19th century Southern oligarchical planter class. How do you see that lineage showing up in what we now call Christian nationalism?
Oh, that's a great question and a very important question in this moment. I believe you could argue, and I don't think I do it in that book, but I have done it elsewhere and will do it elsewhere as well. We tend in the United States, when we think about our modern political movement, to root the rise of the radical right after World War II in the Dixiecrats, the former Democrats in the American South who thoroughly opposed the idea of Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation and any kind of governmental support for Black rights. And there's a very clear lineage to that. You can see that happening by 1948 when President Harry Truman desegregates the American military, and he's a Democrat, of course. You get the formation of the Dixiecrats with people like Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, really doubling down on the idea of segregation. And that group of people quite literally gets picked up by the Republican Party first under Barry Goldwater. Strom Thurmond very clearly publicly switches his political affiliation from Democrat to Republican in 64 to support Barry Goldwater. And then, of course, he continues to be a Republican under Nixon in exchange for the idea that the federal government will not continue to advance Black rights. And that's what we know as the Southern strategy. So we tend to focus on that. But the opposition to the rise of the New Deal government that regulated business and provided a basic social safety net and promoted infrastructure and protected civil rights and underpinned a rules-based international order. The objections to that were always three-pronged. There were the Republican businessmen that I talk about a lot. There were the Dixiecrats, the unreconstructed Southern Democrats. And by the way, that's not the entire South. There are plenty of white Southerners who are more than happy to go along with desegregation. And then there is and that's a long story too. But then there was a third prong, and that was the traditional religious figures. And you think about the New Deal, and people tend to sort of see it as a real break from the past, as it was politically. But remember, the Scopes trial in Tennessee is in 1925. The New Deal starts in 1933. That's not even a decade later. And those traditional religious figures become figures of fun after the Scopes trial, but they don't go away. What they do is they tend to begin to work with the American business community, and they begin to get a foothold in that world. And that idea of opposing the modern American government from that religious position ties into something really important. And that is the idea that traditional religious, and I'm being vague on that because you're going to see the rise of evangelical religion in the 1960s and the 1970s, and that brings the Pentecostals and the fundamentalists and different the traditional Southern Baptists and so on into their own kind of new web. But in those 1920s, 1930s, 1940s incarnations, what you really see there is the attempt to reinstate on the American political and cultural environment the idea of hierarchies, the idea not only of racial hierarchies, which is what people like the Dixiecrats focus on, but also on gender hierarchies, the idea that the man is going to be in charge of women. And one of the things that they really don't like about the New Deal is the idea that it treats women equally. And that's going to be a thread that runs through that not yet evangelical, through that traditional religious group right from the 1920s into the 1930s, into the 1940s, into the 1950s. It goes through some changes in the 1960s, including the real sort of consolidation of this concept of evangelical religion, that's a really interesting development. But then you're going to see something really interesting in 1972. And what you see in 72 is the rise of opposition to abortion from the Republican Party, which had been very much in favor of Planned Parenthood, and the idea of people being in charge of their reproductive health. And that changes in 1972. And it changes in 1972 in a really interesting way, because while we have come to know the abortion movement as one focused, as it is now, on the idea of babies and fetuses, in 72, and I keep emphasizing that number for an obvious reason I'll identify in a second. What they are really talking about is they do not like what they call women's libbers. They don't like the idea of women who are equal to men and who work outside the home. They want women to be back inside the home. And the reason I emphasize that is because they don't have Roe v. Wade yet. Roe v. Wade is the next year. So in 72, you get this inclusion into the Republican Party of this traditional Republican strand that, of course, by Reagan's election is going to be instrumental in his coalition to put him into the White House in 81. He's elected in 80, goes in 81. And that's going to become the evangelical support for the Republican Party that focuses increasingly on abortion and on the abortion movement and the anti-abortion movement. And so you see that strand growing through into the present, where you have this set of evangelical voters who go, I believe it's 91% for Donald Trump, and who remain firmly in his corner, based not so much, I think, on the idea of the American polity, as they are based in the idea that they want to reassert men's dominance over women and the return of women to the home. And obviously that's a really big topic, so I won't go into it more now, but I think you're absolutely right to identify that as a central piece of this current day radical organization that is now the MAGA movement.
And thank you for that. Let's turn a little closer to home and maybe something that's a little more positive. What is the most impactful thing the League of Women Voters, whether national, state, or local, can do to help rebuild democratic norms in states where oligarchical politics have taken hold?
First of all, as I said at the start, I love what the league does. You are that pure group that says it matters to vote. And I think that that's worth taking out even further for a spin and emphasizing. I do think, speaking of that last question, it's interesting that, again, the radical right, as you know, has been demonizing the League of Women Voters as being a far left organization, which it has never been. It has always been nonpartisan, and that's so cool about it. But one of the things that I would emphasize that we all can do, but I think coming from a position of that history of nonpartisanship, that the leagues can do, is the relational organizing that simply says, we don't care how you vote. We think it's important that you vote, because that reinforces the norm that it is, that being a citizen of a democracy is not simply a privilege, it is also a duty. And that idea of talking to people about voting and about the importance of voting and what we can do when we vote is central. And I just did an interview with Ben Wickler, the former Democratic chair of Wisconsin, and he has a new book out that talks about the individual pieces of things people can do to reclaim their democracy. And at this point, this is not a partisan thing at all. It's democracy versus autocracy. And he makes the really important and I think powerful point that there's an election in the United States of America every Tuesday, and that most people don't pay attention to our local elections and our state elections and our court elections and so on. And they're crucial to reinforcing both the norms of democracy, the idea that your voice matters, but also the recovery of our democracy from those who are trying to take it away from us. So I think you have a ton of room to work, especially coming from that position of nonpartisanship.
Okay, we are going to take a question now from the live audience. And your work has taught us that democracy is shaped not just by government, but by ordinary people. What actions by citizens have had the greatest impact on preserving democracy, and what lessons can we draw from those actions? And I think this is a good time to put in a plug for your video series.
Um, sure. So I love this question because I would argue, in fact, that one of the problems the things that has led us to the problems we're in now is the idea over the last several decades that somehow we don't have agency, that individuals don't have agency in this large government we have. And nothing could be further than the truth. The Constitution starts with we, the people, and we give our power temporarily to our elected representatives to act for us. And if we don't support what they're doing, we can take that power back. And that idea that we have agency in changing the future, I think, is crucial for us to understand in this moment. Mind you, I also think it's what the radicals are afraid of and why they're working so hard to try and take people's vote away from them. But there are a couple other things that jump out about we the people and how one reclaims democracy. And the beginning of that is the recognition of community. As my friend Jim Freeman always says, it's all about community. It's all about making sure that that there is joy and friendship in for people, because when you have those positive qualities, the fear and anger of authoritarianism can't take hold. So partly what we can do is simply to build community. And that doesn't mean necessarily around politics. It can be around your hobbies. It can be around anything you want, so long as people break down the barriers that politicians are trying to impose on them. And I have to say, if you look at the polls, I spent the hour before I came on here working on the polls. If you look at the way people feel about American democracy and feel about what this administration is doing, this is not like a 49-51% split in the country. Americans are overwhelmingly in favor of stopping the rise of authoritarianism. So you think about building community, you're really working with people who you might think are divided from you because of what letter comes after their name. But in fact, we're very much united on what we want for the country. And that's true almost across the board on even hot button issues. People agree that they want to see, the sort of legislation that we had in the 1970s or the 1950s to create a really strong community. But then there are a lot of people who feel as if they are not necessarily engaged in politics, because we're all political animals if we're on this call. But for a lot of people, it's a game of inside baseball they're just not interested in. They until it crosses their radar screen with something like infected lettuce, they're just not paying attention. They don't want to pay attention. So what do you do with them, or what do they do? Like, I get it. Like, I don't, I mean, honest to God, I don't even know how American football is played. And I'm in my 60s. I just couldn't ever care. And I know that's almost sacrilege in the United States. Some people feel that way about politics. One of the things that jumps out to me in a moment like this is the 1890s. And in the 1890s, if you think about it, women couldn't vote. And although on the books, marginalized Americans, Black and Brown Americans, had the right to vote, and some did, the vast majority couldn't, right? So what do you do in that case? Do you just disengage and say, well, I can't vote, so I can't participate? And the answer to that is, if you think about the late 19th century, it was an extraordinary flowering of American culture. And by that, I don't mean the whatever kind of culture that certain groups are trying to impose on our past. I mean, we had probably more than 300 different Black newspapers in the United States. We had foreign language newspapers that circulated widely. We had Hispanic newspapers. We had books from all across the spectrum of participants. We had Indigenous Americans from Nebraska and from South Dakota coming back to Washington, D.C. to look at what the city looked like and to meet with their representatives. But we also had extraordinary flowerings of art and music, sculpture, new kinds of clothing, new languages, new kinds of literature. And that participation in constructing a vision of what the country should look like is what makes it, for me, the most interesting period in American history, because no one quite knew yet who was going to win. And so everybody put in an oar. And if you think about what came out of that period, and we're talking about politics, you think about the progressive era and you think about Theodore Roosevelt and so on and so forth. But what you could also think about is things like the basis for what is later going to be an extraordinary change in American art with the Armory exhibit in the early 20th century. You're seeing a whole change in American clothing, so that you're going to get, by the early 1900s, you're starting to get the idea of women wearing shorter skirts so that they can walk out in the streets and not have their skirts get sullied by the slop buckets and the spitting and the horse dung that's in the streets. You're seeing all kinds of new music. You've got blues and jazz, and you've got Scott Joplin in Texas. And you start to see people changing the world in their way and creating the conditions in which new things can grow. And I look around us nowadays, and that's what it looks like to me where we are. So, what can people do in this moment? They can organize people to vote. They can talk about the importance of that. They can make sure people have access to fact-based media. And you can spread fact-based media, and you can push back instantly when you see lies on social media, for example. But you can also paint and sing and, support new fabric designers and contribute to a world that says we don't have to live with the guardrails we had in the past. We can create something entirely new. And for me, as an older person, I look at this as one of my major roles in the world right now is helping younger people, giving them a voice and giving them access to the kind of audiences I have, so that they can change the world. And it may not seem like much, but sometimes helping out a younger person can make all the difference.
Thank you, Heather, for spending part of your afternoon with us today, and we appreciate it greatly. Um, Thank you again for donating a book for us to give away to our participants today. And that winner is Kat Odell from Pullman. And Kat, look for an email from us where we will be asking you where we need to ship the book to. Um, Thank you for the listeners that are here today, and I hope to see you all again this fall. The next book in our series is entitled Treaty Justice: The Northwest Tribes, the Bolt Decision, and the Recognition of Fishing Rights. It was written to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the court decision that made it possible for us to still have salmon today. Goodbye. Have a great afternoon. Thanks again to everyone.
Thank you.